It's like 80 degrees and the sun is out, and it feels like we've just emerged recently from hell, and now we're in some sort of paradise state. Um, yeah, this past Thursday, we did our first C3 pop-up, which was an enormous success, at least in my mind. We had about 80 people there. Many of you were there, and some new faces, and we want to do it again. um, it does cost money, so if this is the sort of thing that you would like to support the experiment and help it to go on, then please, um, as you know, we're a donation-based community. So if we want to do a little more outreach along those lines, we welcome your generous gifts. So behind that were a couple of ideas, and one of them was sort of inspired me over the last few weeks, and I'll just describe it very briefly. That is the Roman Forum. The Roman Forum was a place in Rome, and it sat between these two hills, and it was a place where the sort of ordinary people gathered. And what did they do? They discussed politics, philosophy, art, religion, commerce, all mixed together. It was an incredibly vibrant and creative place where average people, so to speak, had a voice. And that was what was at least inspiring me and kind of trying an experiment like this. In my mind, we need something like a new forum. We don't need to go back to the past. Rome had plenty of problems. I just mean, what would a new forum look like? And sometimes that's the way I think about C3. It's a conversation, like this amazing meditation we heard this morning, and the music, and the readings, and the talking, and the talk back. And we want to involve more people in the conversation, and that means not everyone needs to get in their car and drive to Grand Haven. We can go out in various places in the community just to host a kind of forum like this. And that's the way I saw Thursday, and it was incredible. And it was a forum, and people were in conversation, and there was poetry and music and a few thoughts. And so anyway, I'm very grateful, and I'm very grateful to be a part of this place. It's just that would even allow for new things to happen, and to want to get behind them and want to go out into the world and invite people into sort of a deeper conversation. So anyway, that's enough of a sales pitch for why the pop-up was awesome, and we should try it again and try it in different ways. So anyway, I'm also very excited about this particular talk because in some ways, at least my contribution to this month, which we've been talking about change and the patterns of change, I've largely been hovering around Joseph Campbell, and I brought my Bible this morning. It's called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, Joseph Campbell, also black like other Bibles. And I want to read a passage from it today, and I want to sort of round out my contribution to this part of the conversation. And I want you to look at, if you would please, your little bulletin handout. Can I actually borrow one? I forgot to get one. Thank you, Leslie. As you can see, the circle on the back, I wanted to give you this as an image and keep sort of putting it in front of you, so you could create your own conversation with the image itself, this departure, initiation, and return. And today, good news, we're at the return phase. All right? The cycle has a point to it. It's not all darkness, descent, being overwhelmed, dismantling, or death, in other words. That has a function, both culturally and also individually. There is a kind of death and resurrection, descent and return that is at the very heart of this pattern. And not all people return. It's really, if you read Campbell carefully in some of the myths and stories, not everybody returns. In fact, sometimes people refuse to return. They get stuck in the underworld. I sometimes feel like I'm stuck in the underworld. Let's just talk about darkness, mystery, descent, dismantling forever. You start to fall in love with the mysteries, in part because you're afraid of what the return might ask of you individually or culturally. What would it look like to step back into the world? Because if we're following any kind of classic pattern, you do not come back the same. Don't come back the same, which is scary. Like what Margaret was talking about, stepping out into the world again with a voice, with a story, personally, is very scary. So sometimes you want to remain hidden forever. But the sort of full cycle is about this kind of departure, initiation, and return. In other words, my point is the cycle's going somewhere. And there is a point. And maybe one other piece along those lines. What the great myths, stories, legends, even aspects of certain religions seem to point out is that if there is a descent and return, it's not about just readjusting back into old roles and patterns. That's maybe what we would call a molting. That's probably not a transformation. Just think about the very simple image of a caterpillar to a butterfly. The caterpillar goes through a whole series of moltings, but they're simply sort of readjusting to being a caterpillar, taking on new form, but as a caterpillar. Am I making sense? But that's very different than going into a cocoon and emerging as really what appears to us a totally different being, because it is a totally different being. So just kind of file that one away as an image. What does it look like to return different than how you started? Not just readjusting, renegotiating. By the way, I was thinking about this. I don't know if I mentioned it a couple weeks ago, but it just popped into my head as I was talking, and that has to do with the stages of grief. What are they? They are denial, then anger, correct? Then my favorite, negotiation. And sometimes that's a little what like these all right, something in me and in my culture is dying. If I could just negotiate and maintain my old roles and personas, I could get through. But that too is just a phase. Sort of renegotiating these old roles and patterns. So, what is the point? And I'll be very straightforward today. The point is the death of the ego. That's the point of the hero's journey. It is the death of the ego. Now, nobody talked like that when these great stories and myths were being written and held inside a sacred container and passed on to kids and that sort of stuff, because they didn't use a word like ego. And I want to try to give you a very brief definition of what I mean by that, so we'll sort of be on the same page. The simplest way I can put it is the ego is the very tip of an iceberg of who you think you are. Okay? Who you think you are in the world. And nobody gets out of it. I love it in sort of spiritual circles and say, I'm in an egoless place, which is the ego saying, I'm in an egoless place. It's impossible because it's the tip of consciousness. It's who you think you are. But any kind of deep dive, you are more than who you think you are at any given moment. Would you agree with that? There's something beneath the surface. And any kind of awakening is simply sort of dipping from that well. I am more than just the tip of this iceberg of who I think I am in the world. What we think about as someone who's egotistical, all we mean by that is they don't know that there's an iceberg beneath the surface. They simply say, I know who I am. I know that I know that I know. I'm usually right. I suppose you can have an ego persona that is, I don't know anything. Either way, that's could be a kind of attachment. But that kind of egotism in the world is simply bowing down at the altar of the tip of an iceberg. And what's so lovely, and what these stories tend to have in common is what wakes you up to a larger reality. Usually two paths: great love and great suffering. Sometimes almost both. In other words, you could be going along in life, and I think I mentioned this like last week, and you can fall in love with the wrong person in a kind of act of great love. And guess what? It disrupts who you think you are and also who other people think you are. Correct? Same with suffering. I'm going along in life. I've got all my sort of doing pretty good, and then something comes in from the side and disrupts and forces you to say, is this all I am? In terms of who I think I am? my persona, my ego. So great love and great suffering tend to come in and shake you up. So the point is ego death to who we think we are. Now, let me read just a little bit of Joseph Campbell this morning. I want to read to you the last 2 paragraphs of his book because he says something very interesting to me. He says, not the animal world, not the plant world, not the miracle of the spheres. You'll have to forgive the somewhat sexist language in here. But man himself is now the crucial mystery. So sort of at the conclusion of his life's work, and many of the myths and stories and legends, as you know, are about the animal world, the spheres, the plant world. He's saying it's not that as the central mystery anymore. He's saying there's something about human beings, or he says man here, that is the crucial mystery. He goes on. Man is that alien presence with whom the forces of egoism must come to terms, through whom the ego is to be crucified and resurrected. So at the end of sort of a life's work, which is what this book is, he says, if I could sum things up, we're talking about the ego being crucified and resurrected, and in whose image society is to be reformed. So in case you think we're just talking about your personal journey, and you have a personal journey, that's not what the great pattern is about. Any form of personal transformation is about the transformation of the whole, about society. In other words, what do you return to do? You don't return so you can brag about it on Facebook or whatever. It's about something else, the transformation of the whole, of the community, of the village, of the tribe, of the nation, and of the planet, if you want to have that big of a consciousness. If you, like, I live my life in widening circles. How big is that circle? Man understood, however, not as I, but as thou. It's a bit of the sacred re-entering. For the ideals and temporal institutions of no tribe, race, continent, social class, or century can be the measure of the inexhaustible and multifarious, wonderful divine existence that is in the life of all of us. He's basically saying no race, no tribe, no creed sums up the mystery that all human beings carry in their very essence. A little bit more. The modern hero, and let me just pause for just a second. You might think because I'm so obsessed with myths and stories and legends, and I tend to dip from the well that's behind us, that maybe you think, or maybe you don't, that it would be great if we could just go backwards. I'm not talking about that. You can't go backwards. In fact, Carl Jung says the point is to dream the myths forward into the future. Otherwise, that's what a lot of religions are. If we could just protect the way things once were. I remember when I first, I remember, I was about to say something about my childhood, but I'll just give you a vibe. The general Protestant vibe, especially Protestant evangelical vibe, is if we could just get back to how they did it exactly in the first century, the early church, we would do it right. But that's not really the invitation. You can listen to the past, but it's about living the thing forward. So listen to what he says about the modern hero. The modern hero, the modern individual who dares to heed the call and seek the mansion of that presence with whom it is our whole destiny to be atoned, cannot, indeed must not, wait for his community to cast off its slough of pride, fear, rationalized avarice, and sanctified misunderstanding. Don't wait, that's what he's saying. Don't wait, because it's not going to happen. Not everyone is going to say, you know what? I read your post and I thought, Complete change of worldview. Live, says Nietzsche, as though the day were here, because the day is here. It is not society that is to guide and save the creative hero, but precisely the reverse. And so every one of us shares the supreme ordeal, carries the cross of the Redeemer, not in the bright moments of his tribe's great victories, but in the silences of his personal despair. It's the last word of the book. So it's going to hurt, and you're going to feel lonely at times, but it's not about, I just all of a sudden thought of JFK saying, ask not what you can do, what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. It's a kind of reversal of roles here. So the bad news is any kind of classic dissent is going to hurt. It's going to feel like despair at times. The good news is you're needed in the world to help be an agent for change in your own society, community, family, and culture. That's the point. And the great images for that were the gift. I made a list of them. The medicine bag, the boon, the sacred hoop. Now here's one from early Christianity, the love feast. These are the symbols that you learn, the gifts that you learn, that you carry back and give to the community. The whole orientation moves from how can I be served to how can I be of service? And how can I make my life in a kind of sacred service to other human beings? And now, because we live in the 21st century, we have to say, and also to the planet itself. People didn't have to quite think that way. Their consciousness hadn't reeled out quite that big, but now we have no other choice. We now know, without any doubt, that the tiniest actions have a kind of global impact. Why? Because everything is related. Everything is interconnected, which is at the heart of the bottom of the initiation journey. The approach to the inmost cave is realizing that you are actually connected to everything else. So what am I saying? I'm saying we're called to serve, which sounds kind of old-fashioned. Do you know the word sacrifice means to make sacred? I think that's a little of what the intention here is, to make your life sacred. And you don't have to believe in God for that to be the case. Just saying to make your life a kind of sacred dance in the world. To serve. That's the biggest vision any of us can have, I think. And what this classic descent and return is meant to teach us. And how do I know that's already the case? Because I've met most of you. I know that in your own way, you've gone through this. And some of you have said, I've gone through this cycle several times. How many more times do I need to go through it? Because it hurts. But somehow on the other side of this, you're not closed off in a little cave nursing your wounds. And you have wounds, just like I have wounds. Most of you on your better days are saying, how can I help? How can I be of service? Something in you, something deep in you, trusts that your story and your perspective and your way of life matters in the world. And like Leslie was saying about Wetland Watch, driving over the bridge, it used to be an environmental disaster, and now you can kayak out there. And that's the tip of an iceberg. But it's an opportunity. So I just want to say it as clearly as I can. The point is the death of who you think you are, touching upon a bit of the sacred and your own gifts that are at the very bottom of your wounds and returning in whatever way you can. I love what David White says. To be human is to become visible. To be human is to become visible. To be human is to become visible. Or you can stay hidden. Your choice. By the way, my LGBTQ friends, sometimes I feel like sort of the symbol of coming out of the closet is a much deeper symbol than just coming out of the closet. Listen to David White. To be human is to become visible. Saying, this is who I am. This is who I am. And it challenges everybody in the vicinity to look at their own life. Well, who am I? Then David White says, to be human is to become visible while carrying what is hidden as a gift to others. While carrying what is hidden as a gift to others. You have hidden gifts, and you carry them in kind of a hidden way. You don't need to make a resume, with your, I don't know what you would call them, psycho-spiritual gifts. Like a business card. Hey, this kind of one. No, they're hidden. But you carry them into the world by being a certain kind of person in the world. Which is, in my mind, back to last 2 months theme, it's part of the good life, a life of meaning. So what else? What then happens? And one of the things I think that's powerful, just along the lines of image, in any kind of classic descent and return, you begin to live in the world in a certain way, and you begin, in a sense, creating a new world. You become a participant, and I don't think you can do it alone. That kind of was coming up in our pre-chat thing. Suddenly you feel like, oh, I need some help. I would like to be a part of a conversation. So you don't do it alone, but you are in the business of becoming a creator, a co-creator, a co-participant in the remaking and refashioning of the world. If you want to use old mythic images, the creation of a new heaven and a new earth. That's from the book of Revelation. Probably the most misunderstood book in the entire Bible, by the way. I could do a whole series on Revelation. I don't know if anyone would come. But it is certainly the most misunderstood book in the entire New Testament canon. But it ends with a new heaven and a new earth. And there's a tree that the nations dine from. And it says that the tree is for the healing of the nations. Guess what? You can be a co-participant in the creation of that world. Jesus isn't going to do it for you. He's not going to wave a little magic wand, or fly down on whatever he flies down on, magic carpet, a horse. He comes down on a horse. That's just a mythic symbol for what's happening in the human heart and in the human soul. And would you say we could benefit from a tree that would heal the nations if they ate from this tree? Yeah, I would think so. So you are a participant. You have the privilege of creating sort of a new heaven and a new earth, or other words for it are paradise or nirvana, that sort of thing. So this morning, I wanted us to hear from this prophecy. And I first learned about this from Joanna Macy in her book Widening Circles, and I put it in the bulletin, and she's talking about this prophecy of the Shambhala warrior. And it's not unrelated to the sort of bodhisattva image where upon touching upon enlightenment, there's a kind of refusal until all sentient beings become enlightened. That's the heart of the bodhisattva. You're familiar with this as an image. So you touch upon enlightenment, awakening, descent. You touch upon the gods. You realize the divine within. But instead of staying there and hanging out on your meditation pillow, this is a symbol, you say, I'm going to refuse full enlightenment until all beings are enlightened. So your life becomes an act of service. That's at the heart of the bodhisattva thing. And the Shambhala prophecy is similar. That But they go into a little more detail. There is a coming kingdom, and listen to some of the language here. There comes a time when all life on earth is in danger. When's that time? Barbarian powers have risen. I know, use your imagination. Although they waste their wealth in preparations to annihilate each other, my button's bigger than your button, they have much more in common. Weapons of unfathomable devastation and technology that lay waste the world. It is now when the future of all beings hangs in the balance. By the frailest of threads that the kingdom of the Shambhala emerges. And I think there is something quite powerful in here. I heard Richard Rohr say once, wherever you have the very worst, you have the best. Sometimes periods of great chaos call forth something else. And we're in that age. What else does she talk about here? You cannot go there. Oh, I wish you could. I wish Shambhala was just like Disney World. You just go and you stand in line for hours and get really hot. I wish it was like that. A little paradise and everybody's happy, except they're not. You can't go there, for it is not a place. It exists in the hearts and minds of the Shambhala warriors. And that's a very strong image. We tend not to like image of warriors. But you cannot recognize a Shambhala warrior by sight. In other words, you can't get a tattoo that says, Shambhala killed it right there, it's on my arm. For there's no uniform or insignia, there are no banners. Back to David White, carry what is hidden. There are no barricades from which to threaten the enemy, for the Shambhala warriors have no land of their own. And I'm thinking about Joseph Campbell saying, beyond race and creed and nation and borders and boundaries and walls and fences, the Shambhala warrior doesn't care about that stuff. Always they move in the terrain of the barbarians themselves. And here rests sort of the heart of this. Now you might say, barbarian is kind of harsh language. It's an old prophecy. It tends to use hyperbolic language. I wish I could seal myself off in a progressive, friendly, like we could all just wear coexist stickers and we could just, only talk about poems and art, but I'm sorry, we can't. We move among the barbarians in part because psychospiritual death, you realize the barbarian is also within you. I've seen the enemy and it is me. And once you touch upon that, you can't look at the world the same anymore. You can't create the other as a total enemy. So you move among them because you are among them. She goes on. Now comes the time when great courage is required. Courage, like in the French sense, heart. Moral and physical courage. For they must go into the very heart of the barbarian power and dismantle the weapons, which seems impossible. How can we dismantle weapons? And think about that literally for a moment. Can you dismantle the 6,000 nuclear weapons that we have in a mountain in Colorado? I made up that number. I know there are weapons in Colorado, but I don't know that number. But just imagine those kinds of weapons. And also the weapons of our own industrial growth society with its glut for mountains and oil. We think that seems like too much. And she's saying, no, the Shambhala warrior has that kind of big vision. Here's why. To remove these weapons, in every sense of the word, they must go into the corridors of power where the decisions are made. And that could be the local chamber of commerce. It could be in this room. It could be, it's small and big at the same time. The weapons are made by the human mind. We cannot forget all weapons and all things that are harmful are made by the human mind. They're made by the human mind. They were born in the imagination first. So they're unmade in the human mind. And That means a life of service is not just, hey, how can I help people out? A Shambhala warrior thinks about, how can I dismantle the system itself and the mental constructs that created it? Do you see how that's a big ask? That's why it's a Shambhala warrior. How do we think about systems and sort of everyday, ordinary things? What I'm saying is, I guess I suddenly felt like an old-fashioned preacher. Look into your hearts and ask in what way you are now called in this same sense into this Shambhala warrior image. Now, you might not like the image. You can fashion I free you up to do with what you want with it. But one reason why I like it is because it takes hard work and courage and danger. So the Shambhala warrior works for truth, goodness, and beauty. And here are their two weapons: compassion and insight. Compassion and insight. You only need two weapons. You can add a few if you want, sort of like backup plans. What's powerful about that is insight is to see into something. Maybe you've heard that old social justice parable where bodies keep coming down the river and they keep burying them. And then one day somebody says, why are there bodies in the river? Let's go upstream and find that out. That's insight. That's saying we have to look deeply into things to see where these are coming from. But the other weapon is compassion. To be with. That's what compassion is, to be with, to feel with. Which is a big ask, because I would prefer the weapon of annihilation. Things I don't like, I'll just blow up. Oh wait, that's what everybody else is doing. So it's not working very well. So compassion and insight become the weapons of the Shambhala warrior. And at the C3 event, we used this lovely poem by Diana de Prima. In it, she says, history is a weapon in your hands. History is a weapon in your hands. History is a weapon in your hands. You cannot be a conscientious objector. So you're going to make the world or unmake the world by doing or not doing, your choice. History is a weapon in your hands. You cannot be a conscientious objector. Oh, I wish I could. Just chill out and watch Netflix. So, let me end with a little story, because I'm trying to talk about the biggest things possible and the most scary prospects of a world that's on fire. Saying you have a role, every one of you, me too. And I also want to talk about something very ordinary. I as you know, I used to live in Israel, and one day I was part of this little film crew thing, and we were making a film. And we were in the West Bank. We were deep in the West Bank, and our driver was Palestinian Christian. I wouldn't say he was particularly religious as far as I could tell, but he's a Palestinian Christian. And he says, you know what, let's go to my house for lunch. So he hosts a lunch. He calls it's a bit patriarchal, he calls his wife, make lunch. And within like a couple of hours, there's an enormous feast. And we show up at his house, and he's in the kitchen finishing and helping cooking, and we're sitting around the table, and his kids are there, and they're climbing onto our laps. And who's there? I'll tell you who's there. Palestinian Christian and his family and his kids. There's an Egyptian Muslim cameraman. There's a secular Israeli Jewish person, meaning not religious. There's a British atheist, big surprise. I meant atheist and British. And me, whatever I am, I have no idea. And I had, it was one of the more profound meals that I've had in my life. What did we talk about? I don't know. Was there any hey, how should we host a discussion of inclusion? We just ate together. That's it. We ate together. Really, the most unlikely collection of people. And part of me looks back on that meal and says, this kind of Shambhala warrior action in the world is actually doing extraordinary things in the most ordinary and mundane of places, like your own kitchen table. It can be the big halls of power, but I don't want you to hear, hey, I can't walk into the Senate and give a speech and have people listen to me. Yes, but you can host a meal. Now, and that's what I'm saying, like, that meal represents the possibility of something far more powerful than a summit in Jerusalem on peace, really, because that's mostly a bunch of BS. Because that was actually happening as people were eating at the table. Am I making sense? So I'm saying Shambhala warrior is about doing extraordinary things in the most ordinary of spheres. And you have a voice and a role and a body and a mind and an experience that matters and is needed in the world. And I hope in one sense that C3 is the kind of place where we come for training, warrior training, you know. And we're getting some training in compassion and insight. Because we need some training. among other things, it's a training camp where your story matters and your wounds matter, and so do your gifts, and so do mine. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say today. So to be human is to become visible while carrying what is hidden as a gift to others. Thanks for listening.